Next, we have divide and profit. How the U.S.-Mexico border crisis can be understood as a profitable ethnic conflict. And this is Laura. This is, as I say, divide and profit, how the U.S.-Mexico border crisis can be understood as a profitable ethnic conflict. Laura Waldman, ICERM certified mediator and civil court mediation manager at the Community Mediation Services, Queens, New York.
So earlier today, we heard from Dr. Grimm about some of the correlation between how a decrease in conflict leads to an increase in economic development. My talk's going to be a little bit more cynical. I'm looking at how an increase in ethnic conflict can lead to an increase in how an increase in ethnic conflict can lead to an increase in economic development. And particularly, I'm looking at the way that ethnic conflict drives the U.S.-Mexico border crisis and the companies that reap the benefits, and I'll be exploring a little bit of what crisis means in this context as well. So the part of why I got interested in this topic is because about 6 years ago, I was traveling with a friend through the Southwest, and we went along on a volunteer mission with a group called the Good Samaritans. And the Good Samaritans are a group of volunteers whose mission is saving lives in the desert. And the way that they do that is by leaving gallon jugs of water and blankets and other life-saving supplies at drop points. They told us that there are 5 groups of people you might meet in the desert. The first is Border Patrol. The second is people making the crossing. Then you might meet other volunteers, like with organizations such as No More Deaths, which do similar work. You might meet drug runners, who they said are not dangerous. They'll simply wave, and that's it. You might meet a stray biologist doing some research on the flora and fauna, and you might actually meet militia, who are dangerous. And the way you'll know militia is because they'll have poked holes in the gallon jugs of water, and they'll usually leave debris and beer cans stuck in the cacti spikes. So the militia was responsible for doing things like destroying the water that volunteers had left. This is another wild video that shows someone else doing that. So this is actually Border Patrol destroying the water supplies that are left in the desert. Migrant deaths along the southwest border have ranged from about 250 to 500 people from 1998 to 2014. One such death was of a 6-year-old girl who died of heat stroke, and she was migrating originally from India by way of Mexico. I wanted to point out this particular phrase in the newspaper article. Her death was ruled an accident. I got interested in this concept of an accident because it didn't seem very accidental to me. I was particularly struck by this phrase, that an accident is a non-essential property or quality of an entity or circumstance. For example, the accident of nationality. To me, nationality is the accident. Her death was preventable. So how did we get here where this sort of thing became acceptable? To investigate that question, I thought about the question, under what circumstances do people consider it acceptable to sabotage other people's survival? And I kind of characterize that as 2 different strains. It could be that there's an actual threat, in which case the response is immediate and responsive, or it could be that there's a perceived threat, in which case the response is abstract and preventative, which to me seemed to be the case in this situation where where people are dying of a few feet from safety, really, or a few miles. So just a little context and background. The U.S.-Mexico border has shifted considerably over time. As you can see in this map here, it encompasses California and a whole bunch of states in the Southwest. Then there was this disputed area called the Republic of Texas for 9 years, which was an ethnically mixed both indigenous Mexican and also white settlers were living here, but over the course of those 9 years, the white settlers targeted Mexicans with voting laws and taxes, suing for possession of their land and subjecting them to police violence. So a pretty typical process that we've seen worldwide. That's why you may see some Chicano activists say things like, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." That literally happened. So I wanted to know who is migrating from Mexico to the U.S. Today, because that's changed a lot over time. And I thought this particular graph seemed especially instructive. The decrease in apprehensions of Mexicans was 81% since 2007, whereas there's been an increase in every other group on this chart, including especially Central Americans, but also immigrants from India, Nicaragua, Brazil, Ecuador, Bangladesh, and China. And when I say Central Americans, I should qualify that. Central Americans in the Northern Triangle of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. So, why are people migrating? One reason is poverty and economic inequality. Another is crime and violence, including increased rates of femicide, especially in the Northern Triangle of Central America. Government corruption and weak institutions. I was interested to learn that one of the products of the extreme economic inequality in Central America is that institutions were weakened because there was very little taxation going on. When the wealthiest members of society are also the ones in charge of the government, there's not a whole lot of incentive to tax themselves, and there's nothing to gain by taxing the poorest, who have very little. Another factor is natural disasters and climate change. And people are also migrating throughout the world because of political, religious, or identity-based asylum. So this just highlights how extreme the poverty rates are in that particular region. So I wanted to know, how is all of this being framed? And to do that, I looked at some headlines and opening sentences of articles. So to give you a sense of what some of those are like, what's going on the U.S.-Mexico border tends to be framed as a humanitarian and security crisis. But some articles lean towards saying it's a security crisis, some towards it's a humanitarian crisis. Some attempt to investigate both. I want to explain that my hypothesis is that neither of these explanations are in fact as full a picture as we might understand the situation to be. So just to give you a sample, security crisis, I got some of these from Breitbart and Fox News and Conservative Review. New awful data shows that the border invasion is worse than ever. Or humanitarian crisis. The current influx of children at the U.S. border is an international humanitarian crisis in desperate need of resolution. So kind of that language of urgency. What the security crisis framework misses is that when immigrants' identities are criminalized, existence itself is a crime. It also misses that studies show that U.S. citizens are far more likely to commit crimes than immigrants. And if you want to see a little bit of data on that, here's some examples from the Libertarian Cato Institute and from an independent study, basically showing that of the three groups of native-born citizens, undocumented immigrants, and legal immigrants, native-born American citizens are the most likely to commit crimes, or these particular crimes as well specifically. I think gambling was an exception, and there were a couple other exceptions, but all crimes, certainly the data is pretty clear on that. What the humanitarian crisis framework leaves incomplete. Like the language that allows a little girl's preventable death by dehydration to be called an accident, framing the migration at the U.S.-Mexico border as a humanitarian crisis downplays the element of policymaking and the choices involved in producing a crisis. A natural disaster produces a humanitarian crisis. What is happening at the U.S.-Mexico border is fundamentally preventable and can also be understood as a human rights crisis, or a crisis in values, or a crisis in priorities. This situates the crisis within the responsibility of the dominant group, and I'm going to kind of generalize and say white Americans. there was some political controversy around the term crisis a while back when President Trump first used the term to characterize the situation as humanitarian and national security crisis. Democrats in Congress called it a manufactured crisis and then dialed that back. And they retracted that assessment because they felt like there was real human suffering going on, and they wanted their language to reflect that. Hence retracting that. But there's something about that idea of manufactured crisis that I think is still relevant, and that doesn't necessarily have to negate the fact that real suffering is happening. So I think part of what's driving this is an ethnic conflict. White anxieties about racial replacement are manifest when American or citizen becomes a euphemism for white in public rhetoric. So this often happens through implication. You hear it a lot from President Trump's speech. It's characterized by a dominant group identifying with the enforcement by the state, and state enforcement identifying with the perceived interests of the dominant group, as opposed to the alleged ideals of a democracy with a plurality of ethnicities. So just last week, we saw an episode that made some headlines of Swing Set Susan. And the idea is that, what had happened was there was a white woman in Texas who chased some Latina teenagers off of a playground, saying that the playground was just for children. Meanwhile, they were teenagers playing on swings. She got a lot of coverage. Part of the reason why was because she did something illegal. She pretended she was a police officer. Oh, time. Okay, all right, I'm going to make this really quick. The implications of that seem clear enough. Dominant group grapples for claims to legitimacy. When I went on the Breitbart news page, the next time I did a Google search, I got this ad on my page, donate to build the wall. So the theory that to me relates to this is from Donald L. Hurwitz's Ethnic Groups in Conflict. I'll just read it quickly, and then I'll get right into 2 minutes of the economic development piece. If the presence of ethnic strangers provides an unflattering comparison with one's own group, that is a good reason to emphasize exclusion of the strangers. Homogeneity would remove the irritating comparison. If a group suffers by invidious comparison along the dimension of achievement motivation, it may nonetheless have a special connection with the land that furnishes an alternative basis for relative group evaluation. Groups that do suffer from such comparison tend, therefore, to make stronger claims to priority by virtue of legitimacy, so as to make up on one front what they have lost on another. You often hear stereotypes about, immigrants are so hardworking, and I thought about that in particular with respect to this idea of achievement motivation. So what are the economic opportunities created by this conflict? The economic opportunities are created by the production of crisis. First, you have anti-immigrant rhetoric, then that escalates to policies expanding policing of the border, then that escalates to the creation of infrastructure to support anti-immigrant agendas. As migration policy plays musical chairs of people's lives, Central Americans are leaving behind lands that rich in natural resources. This land is going to be depopulated, is already becoming depopulated, and leaving behind ample opportunity for multinational corporations to swoop in, buy up the land cheaply from people who are experiencing desperate poverty, and get land that's rich in timber, fish, export crops, nickel, iron ore, oil, and a number of other natural resources. The other people who benefit are the operators of child, family, and adult detention centers, the providers of support services, and the banks that finance them all. These companies, the first two categories, you may not have heard many of the names, but the banks have names that are very familiar, like Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, just a few that are right around here. These banks are financing the companies that are doing these things. And this is just to say, this is $1 billion industry. Billions have already been spent on these government contracts. So what's been the response? There's been some divestment. The California Public Employees Retirement System notably divested from two of the major corporations running the support services for detention centers, or rather the detention centers themselves for adults. Then Microsoft had 100 employees protested the fact that Microsoft software was being used by ICE for facial recognition. Microsoft delivered this very lukewarm response, which did not directly address the charges. And here's President Trump with the head of Microsoft. So some at Microsoft were not satisfied with the answer, just to kind of make it short. But not everyone is participating. There are companies that are saying, we refuse. And some of them are the airlines that refuse to transport unaccompanied minors who are victims of child separation. So for activists, the next step is to see if these divestment campaigns can become more meaningful, more organized. But there's also a need for academics to measure their effectiveness, because currently there's a big lack of data. So an open question is there any potential to diffuse ethnic conflict by disrupting economic development and kind of work backwards? Well, a few ideas came to mind. One is that, no, it's not really possible because other corporations will step in to fill the place of those whose efforts were disrupted. No, because ethnic conflict already runs too deep, and once it's escalated, it requires other methods to be diffused, for example, cultural and political methods. Or, yes, maybe there's some hope here, because effectively disrupting economic benefits derived from ethnic conflict will show dominant group solidarity with non-dominant groups, signaling to policymakers that public opinion has shifted and that people will not accept being pitted against one another. And then this was my favorite quote in quite some time. If you've ever wondered what you would have done during the Holocaust, what you're doing now is what you would have done. So thank you very much. I really appreciate allowing me to speak today, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.